If you step outside tonight, and just look up at the night sky, you'd probably assume you're looking at the exact same cosmic landscape humanity is scared at for millennia.
Right. I mean, that's what most people think.
Yeah, but as of today, August 2nd, 2026, you really aren't. If you look closely at those faint little dots moving steadily across the darkness, you are looking at an active battlefield.
Oh, absolutely. It's a war zone up there.
Because right now, 65% of the active satellites sitting above your head, literally more than half of the active infrastructure in Earth's orbit, is controlled by exactly one company.
Which is just, it's a fundamental, almost terrifyingly rapid rewiring of how our planet functions.
It really is.
I mean, we aren't just talking about getting a decent Wi-Fi signal in the woods so you can stream a movie on a camping trip anymore. The stakes are astronomically higher than that.
We're talking about the big stuff.
Exactly. We are talking about the foundation of global cellular markets, sovereign defense capabilities, and really the very architecture of the global internet. The invisible infrastructure of the modern world has just been yanked into low Earth orbit.
And that is exactly the mission for today's deep dive. We're acting as your expert aerospace and SATCOM market analyst.
Yeah.
We're going to unpack the ultimate competitive survival story.
It's definitely a survival story.
Yeah, because on one side you have the new space disruptors, primarily SpaceX's Starlink, basically rewriting the rules of physics and economics.
Mm-hmm.
And on the other side, you have the legacy satellite operators, the regional Asian telecom powerhouses, and these massive state-backed Chinese mega constellations just fighting tooth and nail for survival.
It's the most important arena in the world right now, honestly. If you care about how data moves around this planet, who controls it, and what happens when those systems are challenged, you have to pay attention to this.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand how traditional satellite companies are reacting to this crisis, we have to baseline the exact threat they are facing first. We have to measure the monster in the room.
Yeah, and the scale of Starlink's dominance by early 2026 is, well, it's difficult to wrap your head around if you're looking at historical aerospace metrics.
It breaks all the old models.
It really does. Let's just look at the sheer volume. In February of 2026, Starlink crossed 10 million global active subscribers.
Wow. 10 million.
Right. And to put that in perspective, they added 4.6 million of those subscribers in 2025 alone. They essentially doubled a multi-year customer base in 12 months.
That kind of exponential growth curve is exactly what keeps legacy telecom executives staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m.
Oh, for sure.
It's not just a steady climb, It's an avalanche.
And the infrastructure required to support that avalanche is what's truly staggering. By March 2026, Starlink was operating 10,020 active satellites.
10,020.
Yeah. Before this decade, all of humanity, I mean, every nation, every military, every commercial enterprise combined had maybe a couple of thousand active satellites in orbit total.
And now one single constellation holds that 65% market share.
Exactly. And the financial reality follows the hardware. By the close of 2025, Starlink wasn't just like a side project for SpaceX anymore. It became their largest business segment.
Like their largest.
Yeah, generating $11.4 billion in revenue with $4.4 billion in operating income. It has evolved into a massive cash printing engine.
But the question that immediately comes to mind is, how? Like legacy operators like SES or Eutelsat have been in the satellite communication game for decades.
Decades, yeah.
You have brilliant engineers, massive capital, deep relationships with global governments. Why couldn't they scale like this? What broke the traditional model?
Vertical integration. That is the unfair advantage that broke the industry.
Okay, break that down for me.
So, Starlink's ultimate weapon isn't actually the satellite itself, it's the rocket that carries it. SpaceX owns the Falcon 9, and increasingly the Starship launch vehicles.
Right.
In the legacy aerospace industry, building the satellite and launching the satellite were two completely distinct, incredibly expensive processes.
Right. So if you were a legacy company, you built this billion-dollar school bus-sized satellite, and then you had to go shopping for a ride to space.
Exactly.
You paid United Launch Alliance or Arianespace hundreds of millions of dollars just for the rocket fuel and the launch slot.
Yep. But because Starlink and SpaceX are the same entity, Starlink launches its satellites at raw internal cost.
It's like a delivery business, right?
Mm-hmm.
Imagine a logistics company that doesn't just own the delivery trucks, but they also privately own the interstate highway system.
That's a perfect way to look at it.
And while they own the highway, everyone else, every other delivery company, has to pay exorbitant tolls to that first company just to get their packages on the road.
Exactly. When legacy operators like Eutelsat OneWeb or SES need to put a constellation into orbit today, they frequently have to book a ride on a Falcon 9.
Wow.
Yeah, they are literally writing massive checks to subsidize their biggest competitor.
That is a brutal economic bind to be trapped in. You're funding the very machine that's trying to put you out of business.
It's a nightmare for them. And with tens of thousands of satellites up there, Starlink has built this insurmountable lead in coverage density.
But they aren't just satisfied with selling you, a pizza box-sized dish for your wreath anymore.
No, not at all.
They are fundamentally changing how the data gets from space to the end user,
Yeah.
specifically with direct-to-device
Mhm.
or D2D technology.
And this is where the telecom world is currently experiencing a massive paradigm shift. Starlink is aggressively moving to bypass the dish entirely.
Right.
They are launching larger satellites equipped with these massive phased array antennas designed to beam internet directly to standard unmodified smartphones in your pocket.
Which completely upends the cellular tower business model. I mean, if you're hiking in a remote national park, or you're miles out to sea, and your normal phone suddenly has 5 bars of LTE or 5G because it's talking to a satellite moving 17,000 miles per hour overhead.
Why do we need massive, expensive terrestrial cell towers in rural areas anymore?
Exactly.
You don't, or at least the economic argument for building them completely collapses. But the direct-to-device capability is really only half of the technological leap.
What's the other half?
The technology that truly makes Starlink a unified global network is the optical laser links.
The space lasers. Okay, I feel like we have to pause and actually explain this, because when people hear space lasers, they picture some kind of, I don't know, sci-fi weapon.
Death Star kind of stuff.
Right. What is an optical data link in this context, and how does it actually work? I remember reading about a specific test in August 2025 with a satellite called Starlink G1020, where they pushed a mini laser system.
Yeah, the physics of this are incredibly cool. So in a traditional legacy satellite network, a satellite acts like a simple mirror.
Okay.
The satellite receives a signal from a user on the ground, and it immediately has to beam that signal back down to a massive terrestrial ground station, a gateway that's physically wired into the global fiber optic internet.
Got it.
If the satellite can't see a ground station below it, it simply can't provide internet to the user.
Which is a huge problem over, say, the middle of the Pacific Ocean, where you obviously can't build a ground station.
Precisely. To solve this, Starlink equipped their satellites with optical transceivers.
Okay.
These are highly advanced, incredibly precise lasers that shoot invisible beams of light through the vacuum of space, hitting receivers on other Starlink satellites thousands of kilometers away.
But hitting a target that small, moving that fast, sounds literally impossible. These satellites are orbiting at around 17,000 miles per hour, right?
It's like trying to hit a bullet with another bullet while riding a roller coaster from hundreds of miles away.
That's insane.
It is. But the optical transceivers use fast steering mirrors and adaptive optics to compensate for microscopic vibrations on the spacecraft. So when a user in the middle of the ocean sends an email, the signal goes up to a satellite, which then shoots it via laser to another satellite, which shoots it to another, routing it across the orbital constellation at the speed of light in a vacuum.
Wow.
And light in a vacuum is actually significantly faster than light traveling through a glass fiber optic cable on Earth.
So the network in space acts as its own autonomous router.
Yes. And that August 2025 test of the mini laser on G1020 was a major flex. They achieved 25 gigabit per second data links over distances of 4,000 kilometers.
That's a lot of data.
It is. But the real strategy behind the mini designation is that SpaceX designed this laser terminal to be sold and attached to third-party satellites.
Wait, really?
Yeah. They want to connect government space stations and independent satellites directly into the Starlink network. They don't just want to be an internet provider. They want to be the backbone fiber optic network of the entire solar system.
Okay, hold on. We've just laid out a scenario where a single company has 10,000 satellites, vertical integration of rockets, direct-to-cell phone capability, and a laser-routed space backbone.
Yep.
It sounds utterly invincible. If they are this dominant, is it game over for everyone else? Do the legacy players like SES or national telcos have any actual avenue for survival, or are they just walking dead?
They are very much alive because Starlink, for all its revolutionary tech, has a fundamental physical Achilles heel.
Okay, what is it?
It is an aggressively shared network operating under the strict limits of physics and radio frequency spectrum.
Meaning a single satellite has a hard cap on how much data it can push out at any given microsecond?
Exactly. A Starlink satellite passing overhead illuminates a specific footprint on the Earth. Within that footprint, it only has so much gigabit capacity.
All right.
If one person is in that footprint in, say, rural Montana, they get incredibly fast speeds. But what happens in a dense urban area?
Oh, I see.
Or a massive, busy maritime port like Singapore or Rotterdam, where you suddenly have tens of thousands of users, plus automated shipping container logistics, plus cruise ships, all trying to pull high-definition video from the same satellite at the exact same time.
The bandwidth chokes, it congests. It's like a massive traffic jam on a 4-lane highway.
Yeah.
You can't just magically create more lanes. The radio spectrum is finite.
It severely congests. And that brings us to the economics of the 5-year total cost of ownership, or TCO.
Let's talk about the money.
Starlink is often hailed as this consumer savior, but if you look at the raw math for a rural user, it's actually a premium product.
Let's look at the numbers.
Okay, so a traditional terrestrial DSL connection, slow as it is, might cost around $60 a month. That totals roughly $3,600 over a 5-year period.
Okay.
A 4G LTE fixed wireless connection might run you $80 a month or $4,800 over 5 years.
And Starlink requires buying the hardware upfront.
Right. You are paying around $600 just for the phased array dish, the pizza box, plus around $100 a month for the service. Over 5 years, that's $6,600.
So it is substantially more expensive than traditional rural options.
It is. Now, you are getting phenomenal latency, around 20 to 50 milliseconds compared to DSL, which might drag at over 100 milliseconds.
Sure, if you're a gamer or you live on Zoom calls, you gladly pay that premium.
Exactly. But for critical enterprise and military users, consumer latency isn't the primary metric. They care about service-level agreements, SLAs.
SLAs are essentially a legal contract guaranteeing that a network will not go down.
Right.
I mean, if I'm watching Netflix and the network drops for 30 seconds, I get a buffering wheel and I'm mildly annoyed. If I'm a military commander operating a drone or a global financial institution routing millions of high-frequency trades and the network drops for 30 seconds, that is catastrophic.
They require the industry standard 5 nines of reliability.
5 nines?
Yeah, 99.999% guaranteed uncongested uptime. Because Starlink is a shared dynamic best effort LEO network, it historically struggles to offer those ironclad SLAs over specific high-density areas.
That makes sense.
They can't guarantee you won't experience micro outages during satellite handovers or severe weather events.
And that vulnerability, the inability to absolutely guarantee flawless, dedicated capacity in a shared consumer network, is the exact wedge that legacy and regional players are aggressively exploiting.
It is their absolute lifeline. But before we look at how the legacy Western companies are adapting, we have to look at the other massive geopolitical reaction to Starlink's dominance.
The geopolitical angle.
Right, because while Starlink is dominant in the West, they are restricted globally, they are heavily restricted in places like Russia, and they are completely locked out of the Chinese market.
Well, geopolitics abhors a vacuum. If the United States has a commercial entity controlling 65% of the world's satellites, there is zero chance the Chinese state apparatus just sits back and watches.
Zero chance.
The strategic risk of relying on foreign communication infrastructure is a total non-starter in Beijing.
So how exactly is China responding? They are executing a massive, heavily coordinated, state-backed industrial mobilization to build their own multi-layered mega constellations. And they are moving with a speed that is startling Western analysts.
I bet.
We have to analyze the 3 pillars of this strategy: the Guowang constellation, the Qianfan or Thousand Sails project, and Honghu III.
Okay, let's start with the big one, Guowang. I mean, the name itself translates to national network, which tells you pretty much everything you need to know about the mandate here.
The foundation was laid in April 2021. The Chinese government established a new, heavily funded state-owned enterprise called China Satellite Network Group, or China SatNet.
Okay.
They seeded it immediately with roughly 1.3 billion euros in capital. Their core mission was to act as a centralized authority, sweeping up all the fragmented, localized satellite research projects scattered across different state entities and consolidating them into a singular national effort to build the Guowang mega constellation.
Centralized industrial policy at its most aggressive. And when they filed the orbital paperwork with the International Telecommunication Union, the ITU, which, acts as the global traffic cop for space, They filed under the designation GWA-59 for an incredibly specific and massive number of satellites.
12,992
This
satellites.
is really 13,000.
Yeah, and the architectural design they submitted is brilliant. They aren't just copying Starlink, they're deploying a dual altitude system.
Oh, interesting.
They plan to weave one vast layer of satellites at an altitude of 1,000 kilometers and a secondary lower latency layer at 500 kilometers.
What's the timeline on that?
Well, by early 2026, they only had about 30 of these satellites actively in orbit serving as pathfinders. But the
Okay.
ramp-up schedule is what has people paying attention.
Let's hear it.
They project having 310 operational by the end of 2026, pushing to 900 by 2027, and scaling to a staggering 3,600 annual launches starting in 2028.
That is an incredible acceleration curve. But Guowang is just pillar one.
Yeah.
There's also the Qianfan constellation, also known as the Space Sail constellation, or G60 Starlink.
Operated by Shanghai Space Sail Technologies, and they have been aggressively proving their launch cadence.
Right.
In the back half of last year, they executed a rapid-fire deployment using the Long March 6A rocket launching out of the Taiyuan Satellite Launch Center. They dropped 18 satellites into orbit in August, another 18 in October, and another 18 in December.
Boom, boom, boom. Their initial milestone is 648 satellites deployed by the end of 2025 to establish regional coverage. Right.
Yes.
With the ultimate goal of scaling past 10,000 satellites by 2030.
Exactly. The tactical advantage of the Qianfan network is specifically fast response times and high latitude coverage.
And then, as if two constellations totaling nearly 23,000 satellites weren't enough, we have a third massive project, Honghu III.
Yeah, this one is driven by Hongqing Technology, a subsidiary of the commercial launch company Landspace, planning another 10,000 satellites spread across 6 distinct orbital planes between 340 and 550 kilometers up.
Okay, we have to pause here. Filing paperwork is one thing, but how do they physically build tens of thousands of satellites?
It's the ultimate question.
Starlink spent years inventing an entirely new manufacturing paradigm, essentially bringing Henry Ford's automotive assembly line into aerospace clean rooms to pull this off. Can China actually match that industrial output?
That is the multi-billion-dollar question, and the answer requires looking at China's domestic industrial pivot over the last 3 years.
How's have they done?
They recognize that the bespoke, handcrafted satellite manufacturing model where engineers spend 6 months meticulously testing every single screw on one satellite was obsolete. They have forcefully shifted toward intelligent mass production lines.
So they're industrializing space hardware.
Exactly. A prime example is the Second Academy of CASIC, the China Aerospace Science and Industry Corporation. They developed what they claim is the country's first fully intelligent production line capable of mass-producing small satellites located in Wuhan.
Wow.
You have automated guided vehicles moving satellite chassis between robotic assembly stations, standardized satellite buses where different sensor payloads can just be snapped into place, and AI-driven quality assurance testing.
It's essentially gigafactory principles applied to orbital communications.
And this is backed heavily by regional governments pouring capital into specialized infrastructure. In Guangzhou, in the Namsha district, they have built a sprawling aerospace industrial park.
A whole park just for this.
Yeah. It houses supply chain companies like Shikon Tansu, G-Space, and SpaceOK. They aren't just building a factory, they are building an entire, localized, vertically integrated ecosystem capable of churning out the volume required to fulfill these 10,000 satellite blueprints.
But building them is one thing. Selling the capacity is another. If they are locked out of the United States and facing heavy skepticism in Europe, who is the customer for 33,000 Chinese low Earth orbit satellites?
To understand the customer base, you have to look at the Belt and Road Initiative and imagine it extending into the vacuum of space.
The BRI in orbit.
Exactly. The core geopolitical strategy here is not to compete for consumer broadband subscribers in California or London. They are targeting the Global South, Africa, Latin America, and non-aligned Asian nations.
They are going after the massive populations that still lack reliable infrastructure.
Right. Through commercial entities like SailSpace, which acts as the international commercial arm for the Qianfan program, China is aggressively signing memoranda of understanding with telecom operators and governments across these developing regions.
So it's a package deal.
Very much so. If you are a developing nation that desperately needs high-speed, nationwide internet to modernize your economy, but you do not want to rely on an American corporation like SpaceX.
Perhaps for sovereignty reasons or just because Starlink is too expensive for your local economy?
Right. Beijing is arriving with a highly subsidized, state-backed, turnkey alternative.
And the hidden cost of that subsidized alternative is data sovereignty. Because if a hospital in Nairobi or a government office in Jakarta is using the Guowang network, that data is subject to Chinese regulatory authority.
It creates a parallel global internet infrastructure. The architecture of these networks can be designed so that data routing defaults to ground stations located within Chinese borders or controlled by Chinese entities.
It's massive.
It is an incredibly powerful tool for geopolitical influence, offering connectivity in exchange for integration into the Chinese digital ecosystem.
So we have the tectonic plates shifting, the U.S. private sector dominating the West, and the Chinese state apparatus building a parallel universe for the global South.
That's the lay of the land. Yeah.
But that leaves a massive, highly developed, incredibly complex middle ground. The Asia-Pacific region.
Yes, APAC.
These are economies like Japan, India, South Korea, and Taiwan. They have legacy satellite operators. They have massive domestic telecom monopolies, and they sit right on the geopolitical fault line. How are these traditional Asian powerhouses defending their turf against Starlink's commercial invasion and China's strategic expansion?
The APAC region is arguably the most fascinating theater in this conflict because they aren't trying to outlaunch Starlink on volume.
They know they'd lose that race.
Exactly. They know they can't put 10,000 satellites up faster than SpaceX. Instead, they are executing highly calculated, specialized defensive pivots. They are leveraging local regulatory power, shifting to defense intelligence, and controlling the hardware supply chain.
Okay, let's start with Japan, because their response perfectly illustrates the pivot of a legacy operator. Specifically, we should look at SKY Perfect JSAT and the major Japanese telecom conglomerates.
JSAT is a textbook example of a legacy giant recognizing the existential threat. Historically, JSAT relied entirely on geostationary, or GEO, satellites.
Right.
These are the massive, school bus-sized satellites parked 36,000 kilometers above the equator. They stay fixed over one spot on the Earth, beaming down regional television broadcasts and high-capacity backhaul.
But the latency from 36,000 kilometers out makes GEO terrible for modern interactive internet. The signal physically takes too long to travel up and back down.
Exactly. JSAT realized that trying to fight a low-latency, volume-based consumer internet war against Starlink in low Earth orbit was a guaranteed loss, so they changed the battlefield.
What do?
They announced a strategic transition to become a multi-orbit space solutions provider, and their massive pivot is towards space intelligence and national defense.
Space intelligence, meaning they aren't just acting as a dumb pipe transmitting data from point A to point B, they are actively gathering data from orbit, analyzing it, and selling the insights.
Precisely. They leaned heavily into Japanese national security demands and private sector logistics. For example, they formed a deep collaboration with a Japanese company called IQPS Inc.
IQPS builds small SAR satellite constellations, right? And we should unpack SAR because it is one of the most critical technologies in space right now. It stands for synthetic aperture radar.
Yep. And unlike a traditional optical satellite, which is basically a giant digital camera that relies on the sun to illuminate the Earth, SAR is an active system.
Okay.
A normal camera satellite is entirely useless if it's nighttime or if there's heavy cloud cover or thick smoke from a forest fire.
But a SAR satellite generates its own radio waves.
Yeah.
It beams radar pulses down to the surface, and those waves pass straight through clouds, smoke, and complete darkness. They bounce off the terrain, the buildings, or the ships in the ocean and return to the satellite.
Exactly. It allows you to create high-resolution 3D topological maps of the surface regardless of the weather or time of day.
That's incredibly powerful.
The military and disaster monitoring applications are invaluable. JSAT is procuring this high-resolution SAR imagery, leveraging their decades of expertise in managing secure satellite operations and positioning themselves as the indispensable intelligence hub for Japanese national security. They're making themselves too critical to fail.
But they aren't entirely abandoning communications, right? They formed a joint venture with the Japanese telecom giant NTT called Space Compass. And the tech they're developing sounds like something out of a near-future sci-fi novel.
Space Compass is incredibly ambitious. They are building out an optical data relay network, which involves integrating more laser communications in space to securely route data without relying on vulnerable ground stations.
Right.
But their most fascinating project is the development of HAPS, or high-altitude platform stations.
I'm fascinated by HAPS. Tell me how these work.
Think of a HAPS as a massive, ultra-lightweight, solar-powered drone. But instead of flying at 30,000 feet like a commercial jet, it flies in the stratosphere around 60,000 to 70,000 feet up.
Way above everything.
Yeah, it sits perfectly on station, miles above the weather and commercial air traffic, acting as a localized floating cell tower.
What's the advantage of a stratospheric drone over a satellite?
Latency and targeted capacity. Because a HPS is only 20 kilometers up, compared to a LEO satellite at 500 kilometers, the latency is practically zero.
Oh.
It acts exactly like a terrestrial 5G tower, but it can cover hundreds of square miles of mountainous terrain or coastal islands from above. NTT and JSAT are developing these to provide hyper-dense, zero-latency cellular coverage where terrestrial towers are impossible to build and without the massive launch costs of a satellite.
Meanwhile, the other Japanese telecom players are executing their own integration strategies. You have KDDI heavily allying with Starlink to provide localized cellular backhaul for remote islands.
Right.
Basically saying, if we can't beat them, we will use their LEO capacity to power our local 5G network.
Right.
And Rakuten has become a major backer of AST Space Mobile, which is launching massive unfurling LEO satellites that connect directly to standard cell phones. Japan is essentially hedging every bet through specialized tech and intelligent partnerships.
Which is a stark contrast to how India is handling the disruption. India is often referred to by satellite executives as the absolute holy grail for SATCOM.
Why is India the holy grail?
Because of the raw demographics and geography, India has hundreds of millions of citizens spread across vast rural landscapes where laying fiber optic cables or building thousands of 5G towers is economically unviable.
It's just too big.
It is the perfect textbook use case for low-cost satellite broadband. But the Indian government maintains incredibly strict protectionist regulatory barriers.
You can't just be a foreign company, launch 10,000 satellites, start mailing pizza box dishes to customers in Mumbai, and turn on the network.
Absolutely not. You need localized spectrum allocations, deep domestic partnerships, and explicit government licensing that demands physical ground stations and security compliance within Indian borders. It is a massive regulatory moat.
And this is exactly how legacy satellite players have managed to thrive there. They integrated with the domestic gatekeepers. Let's look at Eutelsat OneWeb. A few years ago, OneWeb was facing bankruptcy. The LEO capital requirements were just too high.
Yep.
And one of their primary financial saviors was Sunil Bharti Mittal, the Indian billionaire and founder of Bharti Airtel, one of India's telecom titans.
What's fascinating here is that Bharti Global stepped in, injected massive capital, and became one of Eutelsat OneWeb's largest shareholders. And look at the strategic result of that bailout.
They got access.
Exactly. Because they had Bharti's immense regulatory leverage and domestic infrastructure, OneWeb India became the first company to secure the necessary GMPCS licenses, the Global Mobile Personal Communication by Satellite licenses, to operate in India.
They secured the regulatory high ground before Starlink could get their foot in the door.
Exactly. They captured the first-mover advantage in the incredibly lucrative business-to-business and cellular backhaul market in India. And the other Indian telecom giant, Reliance Jio, owned by Mukesh Ambani, wasn't about to let Bharti corner the space market.
So what did they do?
Jio formed a joint venture with SES, the massive European legacy operator.
They launched Geospace Fiber. And this is a brilliant technical play because they aren't using LEO satellites like Starlink or OneWeb. They are utilizing SES's medium Earth orbit or MEO satellites.
MEO satellites sit further out, around 8,000 kilometers up. They offer a middle ground, higher throughput capacity than LEO, but significantly lower latency than GEO.
Right.
Geospace Fiber is using SES's MEO constellation to beam massive fiber-like gigabit speeds directly into remote villages, acting as the ultimate backhaul for local Wi-Fi networks.
This entire dynamic proves a critical lesson about the global space economy. Having the most advanced technology or the most satellites in orbit means absolutely nothing if you cannot navigate local regulatory barriers and domestic telecom oligopolies.
Exactly.
India is defending its market by ensuring that whoever wins in space, the local telecom kings, control the revenue on the ground.
And we also need to briefly mention regional players like Singtel, Optus, and AsiaSat in this context because they represent a different kind of defensive play.
How so?
They aren't building their own mega constellations. They are largely playing a defensive game of co-opetition.
Right, because they have locked-in legacy cash cows. AsiaSat and Optus control massive regional video broadcast contracts and local telco backhaul monopolies.
Exactly.
They act as the localized gatekeepers. Instead of spending billions to fight Starlink, they're often choosing to partner reselling LEO capacity to their existing enterprise clients while maintaining their highly profitable, dedicated GEO networks for television and massive data trunking.
It's a very pragmatic defense. But as we move geographically north from India and Southeast Asia, the strategy shifts drastically from commercial defense to sovereign security. We have to look at Taiwan.
Taiwan's approach is entirely unique. They're driven by a profound existential quest for resilience. When Taiwanese strategists look at the geopolitical landscape, they look at the physical internet infrastructure and they see a terrifying vulnerability: undersea fiber optic cables.
Almost all of Taiwan's international data flows through a handful of undersea cables. These cables are fragile.
Very fragile.
They can be damaged by earthquakes, anchor drags from commercial shipping, or in a worst-case scenario, intentionally severed during a geopolitical conflict. If those cables are cut, Taiwan is digitally isolated from the world.
They realize they must have sovereign, independent control over their communications. So the Taiwan Space Agency, TEDS, is rapidly accelerating the development of their own domestic low Earth orbit network, specifically focused on what they call B5G, or Beyond 5G communications.
Beyond 5G is the critical technical standard here. It refers to the upcoming integration of non-terrestrial networks, meaning satellites and high-altitude drones, directly into the global 3GPP cellular standards.
Right.
In a B5G or future 6G world, your smartphone won't care if the cell tower it's talking to is bolted to a building across the street or orbiting 500 kilometers overhead. The handoff will be native and completely seamless.
But while Taiwan is developing their own constellation for sovereign security, their true superpower in the new space economy isn't in launching rockets. It is their absolute monopoly on the hardware supply chain.
The semiconductor advantage. Taiwan's massive, world-leading silicon industry perfectly positions them to dominate the manufacturing of ground terminal components. We are talking about the incredibly complex chipsets and the phased array antennas that sit inside the receiver dishes.
This is a point that is so often overlooked. We get mesmerized by the rockets and the satellites, but a satellite is useless without a receiver on the ground. And a modern flat panel receiver isn't just a piece of curved metal like an old satellite TV dish. It's a phased array antenna.
And we should explain how a phased array works because it's a marvel of engineering. A traditional dish physically rotates on a motorized mount to track a satellite moving across the sky. If the motor breaks, you lose internet.
Right.
A phased array antenna is completely flat and has zero moving parts.
So how does it track a satellite moving at 17,000 miles per hour?
It uses hundreds or even thousands of tiny microscopic antennas laid out on a grid on that flat panel. By using complex Taiwanese silicon microchips to delay the radio signal to specific tiny antennas by a fraction of a microsecond, they can actually manipulate the radio waves.
It bends the beam.
Exactly. The waves interfere with each other, constructive and destructive interference, which electronically tilts and steers the radio beam across the sky instantly. It can track a LEO satellite, drop the connection, and lock onto the next satellite coming over the horizon in milliseconds, all without a single mechanical part moving.
And Taiwan is manufacturing these incredibly complex components for almost everyone. It is the ultimate pick and shovel play.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
I mean, in the 1849 gold rush, the people who consistently made the massive fortunes weren't the miners digging in the dirt hoping to strike gold. It was the merchants who set up shop and sold the pickaxes, the shovels, and the denim jeans to the miners. Taiwan is selling the pickaxes for the space economy.
That's exactly what they're doing.
It doesn't matter if Starlink, Guowang, or Amazon Kuiper wins the orbital battle. Every single one of those networks requires millions of ground terminals, and those terminals require Taiwanese silicon. They win no matter who takes the crown in space.
Exactly. They've made themselves structurally indispensable. And right next door, South Korea is executing its own incredibly rapid evolution in the new space arena, driven by similar security anxieties, but fueled by massive private conglomerates.
South Korea is fascinating right now. They recently launched the Korea Aerospace Administration, KASA, to coordinate this. We're seeing a hard pivot from slow, government-led research and development into a commercially aggressive, private sector-led ecosystem.
The heavyweights moving the needle here are the massive chaebols, the family-run industrial conglomerates. Take Hanwha System.
Okay, what are they up to?
They made a massive investment in Eutelsat OneWeb, similar to what Harty did in India. But internally, Hanwha is intensely focused on developing sovereign space defense technology. They're pouring capital into specialized electronically steered array, or ESA, antennas for military and dual-use applications.
Dual use meaning technology that is highly profitable in the commercial telecom market, but critically vital for military intelligence and secure communications.
Yes. And then you have KT-SAT, the satellite arm of Korea Telecom. They are aggressively pushing a multi-orbit strategy, trying to seamlessly bridge GEO and LEO networks to completely dominate the maritime communication routes across the Pacific Ocean, which is one of the most lucrative shipping lanes on Earth.
The underlying why for South Korea is critical. For them, new space isn't about giving consumers in Seoul faster Netflix streaming. South Korea already has some of the fastest terrestrial internet on the planet.
Exactly.
This is a critical defense mode.
Yeah.
They sit in one of the most volatile geopolitical neighborhoods on Earth. They require absolute sovereign control over their communications architecture. They cannot risk relying entirely on a foreign network, even an allied one like Starlink, during a regional crisis.
No, they can't afford that risk.
So the government is demanding domestic, sovereign capability, and the private sector is capitalizing on the massive contracts required to build it.
It's a very potent combination of defense needs and commercial ambition.
Okay, so we've established how Asia is defending its turf through regulatory moats, hardware monopolies, and defense integration. And we've analyzed China's state-backed mega constellation push. But this brings us to the existential crisis facing the traditional Western legacy giants.
The big guys.
The titans that basically invented commercial satellite communications, SES and Eutelsat. How do they avoid being crushed by the sheer volume and cost efficiency of SpaceX?
Their survival strategy hinges entirely on what industry analysts call the multi-orbit and convergence revolution. The executives at SES and Eutelsat looked at the math, looked at Starlink's launch cadence, and realized they simply cannot win a pure LEO volume war against a company that makes its own rockets.
So they changed the game.
So they decided to change the nature of the service entirely. They're combining orbits.
Let's break down the architecture of this multi-orbit strategy. SES is leveraging their traditional massive GEO satellites combined with their highly advanced medium Earth orbit fleet, specifically a system called O3b mPOWER. Meanwhile, Eutelsat executed a massive merger with OneWeb, combining Eutelsat's legacy GEO fleet with OneWeb's ILEO constellation.
Yeah.
For the listener who isn't a satellite engineer, why go through the headache of combining different orbits? Why not just do ILEO like Starlink?
Because you cannot cheat physics, and physics demands a trade-off between latency and high throughput capacity. Let's dive into the mechanics of this. Low Earth orbit satellites sit very close to the Earth, roughly 500 to 1,200 kilometers up.
Okay.
Because the physical distance the radio wave has to travel is so short, the data completes the round trip very quickly. This results in low latency fast ping times, usually around 20 to 40 milliseconds.
Which is what you absolutely need for interactive tasks.
Yeah.
A Zoom call, high-frequency stock trading, or online gaming. If the latency is too high, people talk over each other on the video call, or the stock trade executes a fraction of a second too late.
Exactly. But LEO has a massive physical drawback. Because the satellite is so close to the Earth, its field of view, the actual footprint on the ground it can see at any one time, is very small.
Oh, I see.
And because it's in low orbit, it has to travel incredibly fast to avoid falling back into the atmosphere, so it zips across the sky in just a few minutes. You need thousands of them to ensure there's always one overhead, and each one can only handle a limited amount of data in that small footprint.
Now let's contrast that with GEO, geostationary orbit.
GEO satellites are parked way out at 36,000 kilometers above the equator. They orbit at the exact same rotational speed as the Earth, meaning they appear to sit perfectly motionless in the sky.
Right.
Because they are so incredibly high up, one single satellite has a massive footprint. It can see an entire hemisphere. And more importantly, you can pump an astronomical amount of dedicated, uncongested, highly focused radio frequency throughput into that single footprint.
But the drawback is the speed of light. Even traveling at the speed of light, it takes time for a radio wave to travel 36,000 kilometers up into space and 36,000 kilometers back down.
That creates high latency. The ping time might be 600 or 700 milliseconds, over half a second of delay. It makes interactive video calls incredibly frustrating.
But there are massive, billion-dollar industries that absolutely do not care about latency. Linear video distribution, good old-fashioned television broadcasting is still a massive cash cow.
Oh, massive.
Between SES and Intelsat, Their GEO fleets carry over 10,000 linear TV networks and high-definition backhaul feeds globally. If you are broadcasting a live soccer match to a continent, it doesn't matter if the signal arrives half a second later than real time. Nobody at home notices. What matters is that you have massive bandwidth over a huge geographic area and the signal never drops.
Exactly. And this physics trade-off is the entire basis of the multi-orbit strategy. By combining LEO or MEO with GEO, legacy operators can walk into a massive enterprise client like a global cruise line, an international airline, or a military command, and offer a unified hybrid package that Starlink cannot match.
We offer you the best of both worlds in a single contract.
Right. They tell the client, when your passengers on the cruise ship want to make FaceTime calls or play online games, our network dynamically routes that traffic through the LEO constellation for low latency. But when your ship's automated systems need to download a massive 100-gigabyte encrypted weather rendering, or you want to stream 4K live television to all 2,000 cabins simultaneously, our network automatically routes that heavy traffic through our uncongested, dedicated GEO satellites.
It's network optimization based on the specific type of data packet being sent. They can offer those strict, critical 99.999% service-level agreements because they aren't relying on a single shared consumer layer. They have multiple distinct physical networks to fall back on.
Yep.
Furthermore, these operators use a variety of spectrum bands, Ka-band, Ku-band, L-band, and S-band, to ensure weather resilience.
That spectrum diversity is crucial. Starlink heavily relies on Ku and Ka bands. Ka band operates at a very high frequency, which means it can carry a massive amount of data. It's the broadband pipe. But physics dictates that high-frequency, short-wavelength radio waves are easily absorbed by water.
Rain fade. If a massive thunderstorm rolls over your house, your Ka-band satellite internet might drop completely because the rain absorbs the signal.
Exactly. But legacy operators also utilize L-band and S-band frequencies. L-band is a much lower frequency with a longer wavelength. It cannot carry as much data. You aren't streaming 4K video over L-band, but those long waves punch right through thunderstorms, heavy cloud cover, and dense foliage.
So it's perfectly reliable.
By combining high-capacity Ka-band with highly resilient L-band, operators like Viasat can guarantee that a maritime vessel or a military unit will never completely lose connection, regardless of the weather.
But managing a network that spans different orbital altitudes and different radio frequencies must be a software engineering nightmare.
The technical complexity is almost unimaginable. The convergence revolution isn't really about the hardware and space. It is about writing incredibly complex AI-driven routing software for the ground terminals.
You have to design an antenna system that can maintain a rock-solid high-bandwidth connection with a GEO satellite that appears perfectly still, while simultaneously utilizing phased array technology to track a LEO satellite tearing across the sky at 17,000 miles per hour.
Yep.
And as that LEO satellite drops below the horizon, the software has to seamlessly hand over the data connection to the next LEO satellite coming into view, without dropping a single packet of data, all while intelligently sorting which data goes to LEO and which goes to GEO based on real-time network congestion and atmospheric weather conditions.
And it has to do all of that calculation in milliseconds, completely invisibly to the user. That is the multi-orbit moat.
But building that moat, designing the software, acquiring the distinct constellations, launching the satellites requires astronomical amounts of capital. You can't just casually pivot a billion-dollar legacy business model into a multi-orbit architecture. You have to consolidate. You have to pool resources to survive. Which brings us to the massive M&A wave currently reshaping the industry, mergers and acquisitions.
The scale of capital consolidation we are witnessing is unprecedented in the history of aerospace. We already touched on Eutelsat's merger with OneWeb, which was a desperate but brilliant move to fuse GEO and LEO capabilities under one roof. But the dominoes kept falling. SES recognized they needed more scale and acquired Intelsat, combining two of the largest legacy GEO operators in the world. And Viasat completely absorbed Inmarsat in a massive deal.
That Viasat-Inmarsat deal created a behemoth, a 23-satellite fleet pushing Chi, L, and S-band spectrum globally. They consolidated the high-capacity broadband tech with the ultra-resilient maritime and aviation tech.
But the acquisition that truly shocked the market, the wildcard move that nobody fully understood until the ink was dry, happened in April 2026.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Amazon's wildcard move. In April 2026, Amazon announced the $11.57 billion acquisition of Globalstar.
Expected to close by 2027.
This requires a deep dive because on the surface it makes no sense. Amazon is already spending billions building Project Kuiper, their own massive 3,236 satellite LEO constellation, meant to compete directly with Starlink. Why on earth would Jeff Bezos spend nearly $12 billion to buy Globalstar, a company with an aging fleet of satellites utilizing older technology?
You have to look past the hardware and look at the invisible assets. Amazon didn't spend $11.57 billion on Globalstar's old satellites. They bought Globalstar for its spectrum rights and its corporate partnerships.
Explain the spectrum play, because radio frequency spectrum is the real estate of the space economy.
Exactly. Radio frequency spectrum is a finite physical resource. You cannot manufacture more of it. And the right to transmit on specific frequencies globally is governed by the ITU. Globalstar, due to its long history, holds the rights to highly coveted mobile satellite service, or MSS spectrum, globally.
And MSS spectrum is chemically different, so to speak, from the Ka-band spectrum that Starlink or Kuiper primarily uses.
Right. Standard Ka-band requires a relatively large, power-hungry receiver dish, the pizza box on your roof. You can't fit a Ka-band dish inside a smartphone.
Obviously not.
But MSS spectrum operates at frequencies specifically designed to communicate with incredibly small, low-power antennas. It is the spectrum required to bypass the dish and talk directly to mobile devices.
Which brings us to the partnership piece of the puzzle. Globalstar is the company that partnered with Apple. They are the backbone network powering the emergency SOS via satellite feature that Apple built directly into the iPhone.
So when Amazon acquired Globalstar, they didn't just buy a satellite company. They bought the globally licensed MSS spectrum required for mobile connectivity, and they bought a direct pre-existing pipeline into the Apple hardware ecosystem.
It is a masterstroke. Amazon is planning to integrate that MSS spectrum and those partnerships into their massive modern Project Kuiper constellation. They are aiming to launch a highly advanced global direct-to-device platform starting in 2028. They aren't just going to fight Starlink for the roof of your house, they're going straight for the smartphone in your pocket.
Which brings all of these incredibly complex threads, the technology, the M&A, the geopolitical maneuvering, into a singular, sobering reality. We are witnessing the birth of what we can only call the splinter net of space.
The splinter, yeah.
Yeah. For the last 30 years, the internet has largely been a unified global infrastructure. That era is over.
We are looking at a profound geopolitical and corporate fragmentation of human connectivity.
If you look at the board today, it is split into massive opposing blocks. On one side, you have the Western commercial ecosystem, SpaceX's Starlink, Amazon Kuiper, and the consolidated multi-orbit giants like SES, Eutelsat, and Viasat.
On the opposing side, you have the Chinese state-backed ecosystem and their geopolitical allies, exclusively utilizing the Guowang and Qianfan mega constellations, operating entirely under Chinese data sovereignty rules and hardware standards.
And in the middle, you have the battlegrounds, the global south, Africa, Latin America, and the highly regulated Asia-Pacific region.
The Wild West.
Basically. These are the arenas where the Western legacy giants and new space disruptors have to desperately forge alliances with local telecom kings like Jio in India or JSAT in Japan, while simultaneously fending off highly subsidized, politically motivated Chinese infrastructure exports.
It is a three-way, multi-layered, trillion-dollar chess match over who controls the routing of human knowledge and global commerce.
It really is.
So if we take everything we've analyzed today and project it forward, we need to arrive at a strategic verdict. Let's look 5 years down the road to 2031. Who survives, who dies, and who ultimately owns the sky? Does the market inevitably consolidate into a brutal US-China LEO duopoly? Just SpaceX versus Guam.
Based on the multi-orbit strategies and regional moats we've discussed, a pure duopoly seems highly unlikely. The legacy players have found their footing.
So it won't be a duopoly.
It won't be a duopoly. Let's break down the winners. First, Starlink will absolutely remain the undisputed global winner for direct-to-consumer broadband, small businesses, and sheer raw volume of data transferred. Their scale, their launch cadence, and their vertical integration are simply too far ahead for anyone to catch up in the pure consumer hardware market.
But the legacy players aren't going to vanish into history.
Far from it. There is a highly profitable, sustainable long-term equilibrium for the multi-orbit legacy players like SES, Eutelsat, and Viasat. Because the most lucrative contracts on Earth, Massive enterprise clients, global aviation fleets, maritime shipping giants like Maersk, and allied military organizations will always be willing to pay a premium for guaranteed, resilient, uncongested capacity.
If you are routing billions of dollars in high-frequency financial data or commanding a fleet of autonomous naval vessels, you do not care if a ground terminal costs $600 or $60,000. You care that the network never ever drops, regardless of weather or urban congestion.
Exactly. The multi-orbit players own the high-margin, high-reliability enterprise space, and the regional integrators, companies like JSAT in Japan, Party in India, or Singtel. They will survive because they control the ultimate terrestrial choke point: domestic regulatory licenses and deep integration with the local telecom infrastructure.
You simply cannot beam internet into a sovereign nation like India profitably without the blessing of the local telecom oligarchy and their ground networks. So if you are an enterprise IT manager listening to this deep dive, trying to plan your global corporate network architecture for 2030, your future isn't about choosing one provider. You aren't going to have a meeting and decide to just buy Starlink or just contract with SES.
Your future is defined by smart, software-defined, multi-network terminals.
You will have a single, flat, phased array antenna mounted on the roof of your corporate headquarters or on the mast of your cargo ship. And that single piece of hardware will dynamically route your data across Starlink's LEO network for a low-latency video conference, instantly switch over to SES's MEO network for a massive encrypted file transfer, and drop down to a local terrestrial 5G network when near a port, seamlessly switching between them based on weather, localized network traffic, and real-time cost per megabyte without you ever noticing.
Which leaves us with one final profound paradigm shift to ponder as we wrap up this analysis. We spent this entire deep dive looking up. We've tracked tens of thousands of satellites, we've debated the physics of orbital altitudes, and we've analyzed the rocketry required to build these mega constellations. But the ultimate victor in the space race might not actually be the company with the most rockets or the biggest satellites in orbit.
If the future is multi-orbit, and advanced optical space lasers are cross-linking all these disparate constellations together in the sky, then space itself becomes commoditized. The raw data pipe in orbit becomes a utility. The real choke point, the absolute bottleneck of this entire trillion-dollar industry, is returning to Earth. It's the ground terminal.
The battle for space might ultimately be won in the silicon foundries on the ground. The entity that manufactures, controls, and licenses the physical phased array antenna sitting on your roof, the transceiver on the mast of a cargo ship, or the microscopic silicon chip buried inside your Apple or Samsung smartphone. That entity will dictate exactly which constellation your data flows through. They become the ultimate gatekeeper to the stars.
It is a remarkable twist. The sky above us is transforming at a pace humanity has never seen, but the control of that sky is firmly rooted in the silicon on the ground. We want to say a warm thank you to you, the listener, for joining us on this deep dive. We've covered a staggering amount of ground and a lot of orbit today. Until next time, keep looking up, but don't forget to pay attention to the technology sitting right in the palm of your hand.